You are barely 12 years old, and you don't yet understand that your body is not your own. The year is 1443, and you stand in the great hall of Bletsoe Castle. Around you, men clad in velvet and fur weigh your future like a prized mare being sold in the marketplace. Your name is Margaret Beaufort, née Beaufort. You are the child of a noble house, but in a world governed by men, it doesn't take long to realize that the value of girls is measured only in currency. The fresh-strewn mint and rosemary beneath your feet conceal the winter dampness seeping from the thick stone walls. Candlelight flickers on the faces of lords and bishops, the silent whispers speaking of alliances and inheritances. Their breaths fog in the cold air. You pull your woolen cloak tightly around your shoulders, but the cold you feel is not just the chill of winter. It is the cold of power and pressure that hangs over the hall. William de la Pole, Duke of Suffolk, appointed as your guardian, gestures toward you with his ring catching the firelight. The girl possesses great lands, he says, with no trace of hesitation in his words. Estates in Somerset, Devon, and Dorset are your inheritance. Now, through a marriage alliance, these lands will be bound to a purpose. You want to ask what that purpose is, but a 12-year-old girl cannot interrupt when powerful men speak. Instead, you look at John de la Pole, who will be your husband by the end of the month. He is only 14 years old. His arms are long for his wrists, and there is a shy awkwardness on his face. He glances at you quickly once, then looks away. Before we delve into the depths of forgotten stories, if you enjoy learning about the secrets and dark events concealed throughout history, liking and subscribing to this video allows us to explore the cold and chilling labyrinths of the past together. By sharing where you are listening from in the comments, we can forge a connection on this mysterious journey. Margaret Beaufort was born in 1443, her existence in a world filled with both blessing and curse. Her father, John Beaufort, traced his blood to the English throne. The Beaufort line originated from the legitimized, yet unpurged, affair between John of Gaunt, Duke of Lancaster, and his mistress, Catherine Swynford. Margaret was only 6 months old when her father died, making her one of the wealthiest heiresses in England. In the 15th century, that wealth was not a gift, but a burden. Rich orphans entered royal wardship, their marriages arranged for political gain. Margaret's wardship was entrusted to William de la Pole, Duke of Suffolk, a man well-versed in child marriages and inheritance control. The Great Hall of Bletsoe had witnessed countless similar agreements from the moment Margaret stood there. The gray limestone walls had absorbed years of whispered intrigues and shouted pronouncements. The tapestries between the windows, depicting hunting scenes, were faded, but still showed nobles chasing deer on horseback. For Margaret, the irony was clear. She was the prey being hunted. The Duke of Suffolk narrated the marriage terms as if Margaret, standing 3 steps away, didn't exist. The wedding would take place at Bletsoe in 14 days. The girl's lands would remain under the Duke's control until she reached adulthood. What they didn't say was understood by all. This arrangement guaranteed the Suffolk family's dominance over Margaret's fortune for many years. The men nodded in agreement, their feet crunching the herbs underfoot. Margaret could smell the sweet decay of the herbs mixed with the earth smell of wool and unwashed bodies. Even nobles in the 1440s rarely bathed, and the hall carried the accumulated scent of a dozen men who rode hard in winter mud. Before the wedding, your husband John de la Pole shifted restlessly beside the great fireplace. The dancing shadows of the flames revealed the uncertainty he tried to hide. At 14, he was also a pawn in this game, just like Margaret. But his gender offered him the illusion of having a say. The wedding took place on a February morning, the ground frosted with beads of ice. Margaret wore a royal blue silk gown. The fabric was foreign to her skin. It was tailored for her small body, but the weight of the silk and the elaborate headpiece made her feel like a child playing dress-up in her mother's clothes. The Bletsoe Chapel was small and cold. The stone walls swallowed sound and light, the flickering candlelight from the iron wall sconces making the saints on the wall appear to move. Kneeling on the stone floor, feeling the ache in her knees through the thin dress, Margaret spoke the Latin words that would bind her to the boy she barely knew. John replied, his voice cracking with unfamiliar words. John, take you Margaret as my wife. The words echoed in the small space, certainly twisting your stomach as they bound your future to him. Margaret spoke her vows with a clear and firm voice. Ego Margareta in marital macipio, that is, I, Margaret, take you, John, as my husband. The words tasted like ash in her mouth, but she had been taught since birth to put duty before emotion. The marriage was consummated the same night, but the two children were not old enough to comprehend what had happened. Medieval law required the marriage to be consummated to be valid, but it also acknowledged that children could not give meaningful consent. This contradiction defined Margaret's early years. As months passed, Margaret began to understand the bitter reality of her situation. She lived under the protection of the de la Pole family, afforded the respect due to her rank. But she was also under strict surveillance, like a valuable piece of property. Her life was scrutinized and controlled at every turn. She could not travel without permission, correspond with the outside world, or make decisions about her lands and income. This was even more apparent during meals in the Great Hall. Margaret sat at the high table with her young husband. The elaborate headpieces and rich fabrics symbolized her status, but she could only speak when addressed. The adults around her discussed matters of state, military campaigns, and political alliances. Her own future depended on the decisions of others. Even the meals were a symbol of hierarchy and control. Margaret was served choice cuts of meat and exotic spices, but she was not left to decide what or when to eat. Servants brought predetermined portions at specific times. Like all other aspects of her daily life, it was completely regulated. But Margaret possessed the intelligence and determination that would make her one of the most powerful women in English history. She listened carefully to every conversation, recording the political alliances, military strategies, and complex relationships among the nobility in her mind. She learned the subtle signs of power, which lord commanded genuine respect, which one relied on fear, and which one was merely ornamental. When the year 1444 arrived, news reached her that would change her life. Her 14-year-old husband, John de la Pole, died suddenly. Official records lacked details about his illness. It was simply recorded that he died at the family estate in Suffolk. Margaret, now 13, was in a position both free and terrifying. Under English law, her marriage to John had not been legally consummated. They were both too young. This technical detail meant that Margaret's inheritance was still hers. She had once again become one of England's wealthiest heiresses, and she was available for remarriage. The news of her husband's death reached her while she was embroidering in the solar room. Margaret was making small, delicate stitches with silk thread. This work, demonstrating her training in domestic arts as a noblewoman, also symbolized her patience and refinement. William de la Pole entered the solar room without ceremony. His face was serious, his eyes calculating. Your husband is dead. There was no warmth, no consolation. The chill wrapped around her like night. Margaret did not pause her embroidery. Showing emotion in front of powerful men was dangerous. Showing weakness meant being exploited. I understand, she murmured. She continued stitching the golden yellow thread with her needle. This color was a royal symbol. Every stitch demonstrated the obedience and skill she had acquired since childhood. Suffolk watched Margaret's composure, assessing her like a piece of merchandise. A girl who received the news of her husband's death without weeping or fainting was capable of behaving appropriately in any political situation. You will remain in this house until other arrangements are made, he said. Margaret knew what this meant. The mourning period would be observed naturally, but not unnecessarily prolonged. This time was enough for Suffolk to finalize the next marriage negotiation. At 13, she had been married and widowed. She was preparing for another marriage that would serve the political needs of men. For a few months, Margaret took lessons in Latin, French, and estate management. But this education was not for independence, but to make her more valuable to her next husband. Her bright intellect and eagerness to learn surprised her tutors. She spoke Latin fluently, reading religious and legal texts in the original language. Her French was elegant and sophisticated, preparing her for international diplomacy. Margaret's inheritance covered thousands of acres of land, fertile farms, stone quarries, forests, mills, fishing rights. Her annual income was high, making her one of the wealthiest individuals in England. But this power came at a heavy cost. Every piece of land, every income, was a tool of political alliances. To marry meant managing her lands and protecting her fortune. To refuse meant losing her inheritance. When spring came, Margaret spoke with her mother in the castle's herb garden. Amidst the scents of lavender, rosemary, and thyme, there were no servants or informers. Her mother, who had navigated her own marriages and political maneuvers, looked at her. There was love and acceptance in her eyes. Your inheritance will be both your strength and your chain. Young Margaret listened silently. She understood that her wealth was both power and vulnerability. When summer arrived, news of her second marriage was delivered. King Henry VI, influenced by his advisors and allies, transferred her wardship to Edmund Tudor. Edmund was about 24 years old, 10 years Margaret's senior, and politically valuable. In the autumn, the second marriage negotiations took place at Westminster Palace. Margaret was now 14 years old enough to grasp the political importance of the marriage, but she had no right to refuse. The wedding took place at Bletsoe Castle at the beginning of 1446. Unlike the previous marriage, the ceremony was much more ostentatious. Margaret wore a gown embroidered in red and gold. She was now accepted not as a child, but as a young woman. Edmund granted her some freedoms while managing her lands, supported her education, and did not prevent her communication with the outside world. But her status as a woman was still limited. Owning land was risky for a woman. Power was always in the hands of men. With Edmund's support, Margaret developed her lands, striving to improve the well-being of the peasants. In the 15th century, this was a rare achievement for a woman. Yet political intrigues never ceased. The conflicts between Lancaster and York repeatedly endangered Margaret and her fortune. In late 1456, she learned she was pregnant with Edmund, whom she had married at 13. This news brought both joy and terror. Joy, because of the necessity of bearing an heir. Terror, because a girl her age understood the physical dangers of childbirth. In the Middle Ages, pregnancy and childbirth always meant a potential risk of death. Margaret's recovery after the birth was slow and difficult. Medical care for young mothers in the Middle Ages was minimal, and the physical trauma she endured left her weak and vulnerable. It was confirmed that she would not have any more children after Henry's birth. But the 13-year-old young widow had to protect her fortune and her son. Political enemies threatened her and her son at every moment. This vulnerability led her to seek a new marriage to ensure her survival. Margaret's choice was Sir Henry Stafford, son of the Duke of Buckingham. Stafford, 30 years old, was a man with political and military experience, capable of protecting her son and Margaret. In 1458, at the age of 15, Margaret entered her third marriage. This marriage was different from her previous experiences. Margaret took an active role in the negotiations. Stafford showed her respect, supported her intellectual development, and honored her role as a mother. Margaret was now beginning to emerge not just as property, but as a powerful political figure in her own right. The years from 1458 to 1471 were a period of relative stability for Margaret. She remained loyal to the Lancastrian cause, learning to use her fortune and influence optimally for her son's future. She provided financial support for military campaigns, forged alliances with other noble families, and developed her diplomatic skills. She managed to survive even the chaotic environment of the Wars of the Roses, applying her political intellect in practice. The death of Henry Stafford in 1471 ended Margaret's most stable marriage. She was now 28 years old. As an experienced, shrewd, and determined woman, she continued to act to secure her son's future. To this end, she made her final marriage to Thomas Stanley, Earl of Derby, a man of power and flexibility. The marriage in 1472 was a partnership built on mutual respect and shared goals. Under Stanley's protection, Margaret began to act more openly as a political figure. She corresponded with other noble families, provided financial support, and implemented strategies that would shape her son's future. The 1470s and 1480s were years of intense political activity for Margaret. She navigated a complex world under the Yorkist rule of Edward IV and Richard III. She chose the right alliances, avoided the traps of her enemies, and advanced her son's interests. The political skills she had learned since childhood enabled her to protect her life and fortune during this period. In 1509, Margaret witnessed her son's death and her grandson's ascension to the throne as Henry VIII. She attended the coronation, but soon fell ill and passed away at the age of 66. Margaret's life summarized a struggle that began at a young age, political genius, and an instinct for survival. Her greatest achievement was founding the Tudor dynasty, making her son king, and securing her grandson's succession to the throne. She left behind a powerful legacy as one of the unforgettable women in English history.